Let's turn our attention to international affairs. I caught up earlier today with Mark Watson. He's the Washington Director for the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. We discussed a range of issues, including the recent meeting between Richard Marles, the Defence Minister, and his Chinese counterpart, and other outcomes from that Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore.
Yeah, absolutely. It was a very positive result, really, all round. Certainly, Defence Minister Marles had a fantastic opportunity there to stake out Australia's position. Getting the opportunity to meet a Chinese counterpart, normally dialogue is a means to an end, not an end in itself. But on this occasion, I would say it was a pretty good result just to have the discussion at all. There was a lot of congruity between the US and Australian positions and the statements that were made. China would have been delighted to hear both Australia and the US say that neither country supports an independent Taiwan, although of course they went on to say that we support the status quo, we oppose any attempt to reunify Taiwan with China by force. But nonetheless, statements were made that I think would have been well received in Beijing and at least opened the opportunity for future dialogue. Of course, we'll have to judge China by its actions, not by its statements, which, by the way, still remain quite aggressive towards Australia and the US.
Yeah, indeed. And at the same time, we're seeing efforts by the Trade Minister to try and engage with his Chinese counterpart in Geneva at the WTO. So I guess the dialogue, one thing, we now await to see whether that dialogue continues in different settings and forums and whether they start to take concrete action as well in terms of some of that economic coercion.
Absolutely. I think everybody now will be looking for even small indications that this wasn't just a flash in the pan, that in fact China, for example, may choose to allow some access to quite a small quantity of whether it's Australian wine or sorghum or a particular beef import. Or indeed, does China not do some things that we've seen them do? Some of the aggressive behaviour by the Australian aircraft. It's hard to know what you're not seeing, but I think if we went for an extended period without those same kinds of provocations, or we saw some positive action from China, then we'd really know we were on some kind of a path here. Although again, I think as other commentators have probably indicated, we don't want to get too far ahead of ourselves, but nonetheless, these are very positive signs.
Indeed, positive signs on that front. What about the signs elsewhere when you look at the early days of the Albanese government, particularly in foreign policy? Within 24 hours of being sworn in, the Prime Minister had met President Biden. What's the view towards the Albanese government in Washington?
Yeah, they've had a bit of a dream run, haven't they, Kieran? And they've taken advantage of the opportunity. And I think so far you'd have to say, they score very well on their national security and international relations scorecard. Here in the US, there was a lot of very positive media reporting around the election of the Albanese government, particularly in the more left-leaning news outlets here. But initially they were drawing comparisons between President Joe Biden and Prime Minister Albanese in terms of their backstory, that President Biden, his family had been through some difficult economic times when he was quite young. And of course, they recognised the origin story, as it were, for our own Prime Minister, having grown up in public housing, been raised by a single mother, and both having risen to the highest elected office in the land. And so there was a lot of very positive press around that and parallels drawn, but also around the election campaign itself. There was a sense that both Prime Minister Albanese and the ALP and President Biden and the Democrats had run small target campaigns and really run on a platform of we're not the other guy. So on the one hand, there was a lot of compare and contrast between, the Conservatives that were defeated in the two elections, one by President Biden, of course, in former President Trump, and one by Prime Minister Albanese in former Prime Minister Scott Morrison.
When you talk about the personal backstory, it's very interesting, or the log cabin story, as Americans describe it. It was something that seemed to resonate with the Indonesian president as well. He made reference to that too. Do these things matter? And, that personal rapport question between leaders?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, of course, at the end of the day, it's national interest and it's the big picture, strategic issues that will prevail. But there's no denying that personal chemistry is important, and particularly over time, as people are able to build up a series of meetings and get to know each other. And you may not know when you'll need that kind of personal chemistry and personal trust until there's a crisis, and then there's a phone call and the person on the other end takes the call because they know who you are. It was pretty clear, I think, at the Quad meeting, for example, that President Biden and Prime Minister Albanese seemed very comfortable in each other's company. As my daughter described it, they were broing out big time, and they did seem to be have an instant rapport. And part of that is built around their respective stories. They both come from political parties that have been built on the back of respecting and trying to protect the interests of working people on both sides of the Pacific. And so it's not surprising, perhaps. But no, that personal dimension is important, as it is in all aspects of life. It's important in international relations as well.
And finally, Mark, before you go, I've noticed there's been a bit of a fall in popular support in the United States for the efforts in Ukraine. Explain to me what it's like there on the ground. What's happening?
Look, there's still, widespread support. There's no doubt about that. But what we're seeing in the polls, the opinion polls, and I mean through a number of different polling agencies, so I think it's almost like a poll of polls, that there is a sense that there is a very large price tag on this for the US people. And in particular, there's a direct line being drawn between the cost of the war, both in terms of the aid being provided, but also in terms of the cost at the petrol pump, which is feeding into a very high inflation number here in the US, running at around 8.6%. And connections are being drawn between the price of fuel and the sanctions, for example, on Russia. So it's as much a case that domestic economic issues are beginning to crowd out this big picture Ukraine-Russia story. It's not quite as prevalent at the top of the news feeds as it once was. And as I say, I think a lot of Americans are now really looking to domestic economic issues as their number one concern, rather than a war between Russia and Ukraine.
Mark Watson, Director of the Australian Strategic Policy Institute's Washington office. Thank you, as always. Talk to you soon.
Thanks, Kieran.